I have an epigraph to my talk, an epigraph constituted by a crucial statement made by someone whom some of the Shahbag movement activists themselves enthusiastically remembered at one point, an epigraph taken from none other than Maulana Bhashani himself, one of the foremost leaders of the Bengali masses, Bengali peasants and workers in particular. So to quote Bhashani, I'm quoting in Bengali and then I will provide a quick translation of that particular quotation. So to quote Bhashani, Pujibad, Samrajyabad, Rashtra ebong Srenir Proshno Uccho Rakhiya, Jahara, Desh o Duniyar, Julum o Obicharer Kotha Bolia, Chokher Pani Falen ar Kator hon, Tahader Apato Drishtite Dorodi Mone Hoileও তাহারা জুলুম আর অবিচারের পক্ষেই অবস্থান নেয়, unquote. Well, I mean, now my Bhashani and my quick, rather not too literal translation is this: those who speak of and even shed tears over oppression and injustice in the country and in the world at large, while remaining silent about the questions of capitalism, imperialism, state, and class, may appear sympathetic to the cause of the oppressed, but they, in the final instance, remain complicit in the oppression and injustice in question, unquote. I will return to the questions of capital, empire, state, and class, along with the questions of gender, ethnicity, nationality, and of course the question of religion itself, as they variously implicate and imbricate one another, while also informing and inflecting the production of daily practices as well as the contemporary conjuncture that has witnessed the Shahbag movement itself. Let me rehearse Bhashani again, and also Antonio Gramsci from a different, another, but related register, to say that while it is important to attend to the differentia specifica of a given event or a given experience, it is equally important to relate a specific event or a specific experience to the larger structures of power relations and production relations. Given this, then, the Shahbag movement as a conjunctural event, if not an event in the sense of being an epistemologically inaccessible total rupture or break, cannot be understood in an isolated abstraction from the totality of the very political culture that has evolved over the last 42 years in Bangladesh. That being said, let me make a few preliminary observations about the Shahbag movement itself. Indeed, I don't intend to glorify, idealize, or romanticize whose pitfalls and shortcomings are becoming increasingly evident, nor do I want to reduce the movement to a mere middle-class, reactionary, even a fascist event stage-managed as it was by the Awami League itself. Although it is true that the Awami League, the mainstream party in power in Bangladesh, whose own, within quote, fascist character has already been theorized by a number of folks, has remarkably appropriated the movement, trying to evacuate the movement of its possible radical anti-ruling class character and content, although that evacuation was neither absolute nor complete in ways in which hegemony itself, as Gramsci suggested quite some time back, is neither absolute nor complete. In fact, one can reckon the Shahbag movement itself as an assemblage of heterogeneous elements or participants in an ostensibly momentary constellation, meaning that as many as 100,000 people, I mean from 100,000 people to 500,000 people who initially joined and took part in the movement cannot simply be homogenized into or reduced to the Awami League's puppets, bereft, as it were, of their agency and their ideology. That itself, I think, would be a form of violence, as a number of blogger activists themselves have pointed out. I should also point out that the movement initially, if not consistently, spread like wildfire to more than 25 districts of the country, including some rural areas, marking a certain passage from what's called the class line to what's called the mass line, or assuming even a national popular character. National popular is the term that comes from Antonio Gramsci again, assuming a mass character for some time. Of course, the movement had its own ups and downs over a period of, say, 4 weeks. Although the Shahbag movement remained predominantly, if not exclusively, I repeat my words, this is crucial, predominantly, if not exclusively, a city-centric middle-class movement with an aspiration for a national unity, an aspiration that was, however, thwarted subsequently, for a cluster of interconnected and complex reasons, which I cannot recount in detail here, owing to time constraints. Now, let me make a conceptual leap here and make 3 points. Now, within the Shahbag movement itself, there have been certain radical currents that have been routinely marginalized, repressed, even sometimes totally ignored, and let's say subalternized, both inside and outside, currents that constitute what might be called the radical underside of the movement, currents that could not assume predominance owing to the increasing appropriation of the movement by the Army League itself. Such currents are roughly constituted by left-minded but non-partisan blogger activists, young writers and journalists and artists, various kinds, college and university students, and of course the people in general, ones who do not belong to any political party whatsoever, but ones who, to put it bluntly, hate all the mainstream political parties with a vengeance. It is to these ignored currents I turn now in order to bring to the fore some of their positions and formulations, if not all of them, ones that have by now emanated from hundreds and hundreds of blog posts and narratives and Facebook notes that have been in circulation, particularly during the first 3 weeks of the movement, among other sites and subjects and scenes. Let me provide them a few views, some of their views, categorically, one by one, that at least partially characterize what might be called the underside, rather the radical underside of the Shahbag movement itself. First, as for the specific demands of the Shahbag movement made initially, those belonging to the underside, the other Shahbag, if not the total other of Shahbag, hold that such demands are necessary insofar as they underline and bring back the unresolved questions of history, and insofar as they also underline and bring back the question of the politico-ethical legitimacy of Bangladesh itself as a sovereign, independent nation-state. On the other, the issue of capital punishment in this instance has been questioned by some, of course, while others hold that there is a difference between categorical capital punishment for an individual and ensuring the highest punishment for a historically proven war criminal, insofar as it is the masses themselves who come to redefine the meaning of capital punishment itself, while even reproducing its symbolic significance and resonance and registers. Further, those radical currents hold that such demands are necessary, and that they even might serve as a trigger for an entire constellation of other demands, but they are still profoundly insufficient. As some of the undersiders, if you will, undersiders themselves indicate, those whom we call reformers intend to do what they can and whatever is possible and even legitimate within the given system. But there are others, the revolutionaries, who aim at what's called the politics of the impossible. As Bhashani, like the black revolutionary writer James Baldwin, used to say that the least that we can demand is the impossible. Indeed, the kind of politics that aims at nothing short of a total rupture, a total break with the system, while aiming at a fundamental socio-economic and political transformation of Bangladesh. Is the Shahbag movement than a revolutionary one. In fact, our panelist, Nazmul, already responded to the question. He said no, and those undersiders I'm talking about have also said a resounding no. No, this is not a revolutionary movement. While they also indicate that there are many within the movement who continue to harbor revolutionary aspirations and desires, for whom the Shahbag movement is not an end, but a means to an end, to put it bluntly. Second, according to the other Shahbag, then, like the meaning of capital punishment, the very meaning of Rajakar has been recreated. As the other Shahbagians hold, instead of calling anyone who disagrees with the movement a Rajakar, it is important that one locates the Rajakars in actual historical context and locate them even in relations to actually existing and historically evolving power relations and production relations. In other words, in Bangladesh, the Rajakars have not only hitherto existed physically, but they have also been rehabilitated and recreated within the very horizon of the mainstream dominant political culture that itself has been flagrantly Rajakarized. It is this political ideological process of Rajakarization that should not be lost sight of. I have elsewhere theorized the mainstream political culture of Bangladesh in certain ways, a culture that has evolved over the last 42 years, a culture that can be characterized by certain relatively distinct yet profoundly interconnected trends that may be categorically spelled out as like this. Thus, number one, at the level of class struggle, yes, every moment is a moment of class struggle. And at the level of political economy, let me put it this way. The neo-primitive accumulationization, if you will, that's not idiomatic, it's a word that I have made up now, and if you will, of politics and the politicization of neo-primitive accumulation in Bangladesh, attesting to the uneven development of capitalism. Two, the bureaucratization of politics and the politicization of bureaucrats. Three, the militarization of politics and the politicization of the military. And four, the communalization of politics and the politics of what might be called, within quote, communalized Islam, Islam being an overdetermined site and subject of practices and interventions. It is then within the horizon of this mainstream political culture that to speak of the Rajakars is surely to speak of the Jamaat Shibir, of course, but is also to speak of the Awami League, the BNP, the Jatiya Party, and their allied forces who are variously responsible for the rehabilitation of the Rajakars in Bangladesh. Also, as the other and somewhat othered Shahbag suggests, one should not let US imperialism off the hook. Here, in fact, US imperialism is the biggest Rajakar insofar as it has lent political, financial, ideological support to Pakistan and the Jamaat Islam for a long time, while of course directly opposing the National Liberation Movement of Bangladesh in 1971, not only diplomatically but also militarily. And over the last 42 years, there hasn't been a single government in Bangladesh that has been able to defy the dictates of US imperialism as such. Thus, within the Shahbag movement itself, some even went to the extent of charting out the major contradictions of our times in Bangladesh, the people of Bangladesh on the one hand versus the national ruling classes of Bangladesh in their variously orchestrated class alliances with US imperialism and transnational corporations on the other. Third and last, but by no means least, there had been quite some talk of Dityo Mukti, the second liberation war that is within the Shahbag movement. So, according to the other and other Shahbagians, what is called Mukti Juddher Chetona, or the consciousness of liberation, has by now been rendered rhetorically empty or emptily rhetorical on the basis of a certain soggy class, gender, race, ethnicity erasing nationalism, while it is high time that we, according to those other Shahbagians, it's high time that we reclaim the consciousness of liberation from the Awami League and by extension the national ruling classes in Bangladesh and their allied forces, including their own organic intellectuals and so-called civil societies. What liberation then are we talking about here? Whose liberation is it anyway? These are the questions that they tried to address. And raising this question, is it possible to speak of a new politics of liberation and emancipation here? According to the radical currents within the Shahbag, to speak of liberation then is to speak of the liberation and emancipation of the majority of the people in Bangladesh. And when we speak of the majority of the people in Bangladesh, we are speaking of the peasant and the proletariat, the toiling masses themselves. And to speak of liberation further and mark this structural class genocide that is continuing with a vengeance in Bangladesh. This sour tragedy, or we can call it the massacre. I think the massacre is a better word than the tragedy here. The sour massacre is the latest in this, in a series of events that clearly attest to this continuing structural class genocide, one we have been witnessing for some time. One might say that since the birth, actually, of Bangladesh, insofar as the class question still has been there, because it is the middle class politics that has repeatedly come to the fore. So that's one of the issues that those other Shahbagites wanted to deal with within the Shahbag movement itself. Now, also, to speak of this liberation is to speak of the liberation of women, of course, and their liberation from all forms and forces of oppression and exploitation, and also to speak of the liberation of, other nations within Bangladesh, religious, ethnic, and linguistic minorities, and again, from all forms and forces of oppression. Given all this then, a new politics in Bangladesh, as they suggest, cannot but be a politics of revolutionary democratization. Not just this electoral democracy or representative democracy, but revolutionary democratization, a politics of revolutionary decolonization, a politics of revolutionary depatriarchalization, profoundly interconnected as they are, and thus a politics of a revolutionary transformation of our politics itself. The other Shahbagians seem to be saying we are realists because we dream the impossible. Now I have a couple of poems that actually respond to these other Shahbags, very short poems, and I'll read them and then I'll be done. There are two fragments. It's actually one poem. A poem in two fragments. Fragment 1. There are silences in the world. Silences that burn. Silences that turn into sighs and cries. Silences that accumulate. Silences that erupt like volcanoes. Silences that explode like bombs against the murderer of the world and the killer of truth. Silences that write the saddest and happiest lines. Silences that sing in the syllables of the rain. Silences that weave the warm quilt of a mother's love on a December night in the heart of an old peasant. But there are silences in the world, silences of the petty bourgeoisie, silences of the traitor, silences that serve safety and security and submission, silences that make a silent pact with inaction and comfort, and silences that suck up to oppressive power. Fragment 2. Withstand my words if you can. See, some of my words are boiling. Some of them are roaring and raging, and some of them are erupting, and some of them are bursting volubly in the heat of anger, and some of them have meanwhile caught fire, and some of them are burned into ashes, and some of them are obscene, and some of them are flippant, and some of them are imprecise, and some of them run the trills of the palm tree's colatura, and some of them are butterflies in a bloodbath of salt, and some of them are feeble whispers, and some of them are bitter, and some of them are sore, and some of them are muffled and confused, and some of them are posters, and some of them are slogans, and some of them are songs, and some of them are lost, and some of them are unspoken, and some of them are yet to be born. Words are weapons, provided you know how to hold them right. Thank you all. Thanks for being here.